Michael Hartnett grew up in Newcastle West in County Limerick, and the Éigse Michael Hartnett honours his poetry and his life. He spent a lot of his young life living with his grandmother in a small house outside the town, and she and the dying way of life she represented were a huge influence on him.
He saw an Ireland that was declining. You know, at this period in the 1940s, Ireland was changing rapidly, and his grandmother was kind of the end of her era or her generation, and he saw that this world was changing, and I think this really affected his young mind. His grandmother had a huge influence on him. Actually, when he was still a kid, he was sitting in a field with her, and he disturbed a nest of wrens, and they flew up and landed on him, and she, being a superstitious woman, turned to him and said, "This is a sign you're going to become a poet." And he wrote about this later in a poem called A Necklace of Wrens.
His poetry is regarded as timeless. He writes about one's own place, exile, emigration, the lives of his neighbours and friends and working class people. Many of those in his poems are still living in the town, and his work continues to attract young followers.
He was an extraordinary writer. The word genius is too often used, but he was a genius. He had the knack of writing a very profound, deep and profound poetry that touched the common person.
Well, I think it's very approachable and it's very direct, and it deals with kind of the timeless themes, as they say. So from that point of view, I think his poetry is very approachable, and I'd be maybe a bit biased, but I think he's a great poet, and I think it's showing that there's a great interest in his poetry, and maybe a growing interest in his poetry. Since his death, untimely death. He'd certainly died before his time, Michael did.
But the Éigse discusses much more than poetry. The disciplines and responsibilities of the hard-working poet and the relevance of these qualities in today's digital media world are the subject of tonight's keynote address.
I became interested in Hartnett about 15, 20 years ago, and I think he had an incredible love of Ireland, an incredible love of Irishness, even though he was conflicted at times as to the definition of that, particularly around language, and a huge interest in people and a huge empathy. He also had an edge to his poetry, which I've always liked, but I think that sense of Irishness, in terms of what I'm talking about tonight, I'm trying to relate that to the media world, and particularly to RTE and the role and responsibility that we have in preserving and promoting Irish culture, in showing Irish history, and in telling Irish stories.
Éigse Michael Hartnett opens in Newcastle West tonight and continues until Saturday. Cathy Halloran, RTE News, Limerick.